Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving into a deeply important and, let's be honest, challenging topic. Group-based child sexual exploitation and abuse.
Mm,
Shining a light on this is difficult, but it's absolutely vital work if we're going to understand it and, well, figure out how to stop it.
absolutely.
And reports like the one we're exploring today, they're essential resources, aren't they, for understanding past failures and charting a path forward, even when they reveal some really uncomfortable truths.
It is indeed. And this is a topic that requires careful handling, particularly given the profound impact on survivors.
Right.
As the audit itself notes, we owe a tremendous debt to those who have shared their stories and experiences, often reliving immense trauma to help bring these issues to light. This deep dive absolutely acknowledges that.
And our source material today is a really significant piece of work.
Yeah.
A national audit on group-based child sexual exploitation and abuse. Audits like this are commissioned precisely to take a hard, independent look at complex issues. To understand what's happening on the ground, what's gone wrong in the systems designed to protect, and crucially, to propose a path forward based on evidence.
That's right. The audit was tasked with providing that independent assessment, drawing on a wide range of information, not just statistics, but also insights from those with lived experience, frontline professionals, and existing research and reviews. It's a big undertaking.
So our mission in this deep dive is to go through this audit, understand its key findings in detail, report the facts it presents as clearly and impartially as possible, and explore what it tells us about the current state of efforts to tackle this incredibly difficult issue.
Yeah.
We're focusing strictly on the details presented within this important report.
Precisely. It's essential, given the sensitivity of the subject matter, to stick to the factual content presented within the audit itself. Our role here is to guide you, the listener, through the report's complex findings respectfully and accurately, helping you understand what the audit actually found.
Right. And we want to be really explicit here. Again, this is a sensitive and difficult topic, especially for survivors. We are committed to handling the information with the utmost respect and impartiality, presenting the facts strictly as they are presented in this audit. Reports like this often contain crucial information that is hard for anyone outside of policy circles to access or, synthesize on their own.
And that's where this deep dive comes in. It's designed to be that shortcut for you, helping you understand the core insights of this significant audit without having to wade through the entire document yourself. We're here to unpack this together.
Okay, let's dive into this important audit. So first up, let's establish how the audit defines group-based child sexual exploitation. It's a specific term. What does the report mean by this?
Okay, so the audit defines group-based child sexual exploitation as where there is more than one perpetrator involved, and importantly, they have some form of connection.
Connection. Like how?
This could be through relatives, work, or existing social links. The audit describes it specifically as formal and informal groups of men preying on girls, coercing, manipulating, and deceiving them in pursuit of sexual gratification and power.
Okay, so it's not just multiple random attackers, but perpetrators with a connection, often men targeting girls, using very specific methods. How does that fit within the broader landscape of child sexual abuse or exploitation? The report mentions these broader terms, too.
It does. Child sexual exploitation, or CSE, is presented as a subset of broader child sexual abuse, CSA. The audit also touches on the historical context, noting the significant shift in public attitudes and understanding over time.
Which is important context.
Absolutely. Tragically, what were once sometimes seen as child prostitutes are now rightly understood to be victims of child sexual exploitation. The audit notes this shift was even reflected in legislation, with the term child prostitution being removed from legislation back in 2015.
That's an important evolution in how this issue is framed and understood legally and societally. And the report mentions the grooming gangs model, specifically in the context of group-based CSE. What are the key elements of that process described by the audit?
Well, the audit describes perpetrators actively targeting vulnerable children. These are often children identified as being particularly susceptible, maybe children who are in care, who have experienced abuse before, have repeated episodes of going missing, or perhaps have learning or physical disabilities.
So they actively seek out vulnerability.
Yes. And the grooming process itself involves showering the child with gifts and attention, often using what's called the boyfriend model, treating them kindly initially, sharing secrets to build trust.
So building that seemingly caring relationship and then dependency is a core tactic.
Exactly. The primary aim is to isolate victims from friends and family, making them increasingly reliant on the abuser, who they might come to regard as their boyfriend. The audit also details the use of drugs and alcohol to increase compliance and create dependency, sometimes offered in exchange for sex with one or more men.
And then it shifts.
As grooming progresses, coercion and violence may follow to increase control and eliminate resistance. The audit quotes an Operation Repriever case summary to powerfully illustrate this. There had been grooming behavior designed to extinguish freedom of choice, to create an illusion of consent.
That quote really drives home the manipulative core of grooming, that even if something looks like consent, it's an illusion created by coercion. And the audit makes a crucial point about consent here, doesn't it? Connecting back to the definition of exploitation.
Yes, it highlights that exploitation can occur even if the sexual activity appears consensual. This is a critical legal and safeguarding principle.
It seems obvious, but clearly needs stating.
It does. The audit references the statutory definition from the Department for Education, which explicitly states the victim may have been sexually exploited even if the sexual activity appears consensual. The report emphasizes this represents progress from earlier definitions that included victims voluntarily engaging in sex, recognizing that manipulation can override genuine consent. However.
There's a however.
Yes. Despite this clearer definition, the audit notes there's still inconsistency and poor understanding of this principle among some professionals in practice.
Still, okay. That point about appears consensual is really vital to understanding the nature of exploitation. That it's not about physical resistance, but the absence of free choice. Now, the report aimed to look at the scale of the problem nationally. Were they able to give a definitive number for group-based CSE?
This is a major and arguably stark finding right up front in the audit. It explicitly states it was unable to provide an assessment on the scale of group-based child sexual exploitation.
Unable, after all the reviews and reports. Why is that? Why couldn't they pin it down?
Well, the primary reason given is the persistent issue of confusing and inconsistently applied definitions and data sets across different agencies and data sets over many years. It's just messy.
Messy data.
Exactly. The audit calls this a failure of public policy over many years, that there remains no accurate assessment of the scale. This lack of clear, consistent data collection and definition application makes it basically impossible to get a reliable national figure.
So even with significant public concern and numerous reviews, we still lack a clear national picture of the scale of group-based CSE because the data systems aren't designed to capture it consistently. That's a critical takeaway from the report.
It really is.
But the audit does present some data that's available with caveats, right?
Yeah.
What do those numbers look like?
It presents police-recorded crime data for 2024, published by the Office for National Statistics, which shows just over 100,000 offenses of child sexual abuse and exploitation were recorded in that year.
Okay, 100,000 total CSAE offenses recorded by police nationally. And how does that break down according to the audit? Does it give more detail?
Yeah, it does. Around 60% of those were contact offenses, so in-person abuse, with the remainder being online offenses.
Okay, 60% contact.
And within those contact offenses, an estimated 17,100 were flagged by police as child sexual exploitation in police-recorded crime data.
So 17,100 contact offenses potentially linked to broader CSE based on how police flag cases. Is there a specific figure for group-based CSE within that?
Yes, but it comes from a newer police data set used by the CSE Task Force called the Complex and Organized Child Abuse Data, or COCAD.
COCAD, go.
This data set, which covers all child sexual abuse contact crimes, including group-based offending, identified around 700 recorded offenses of group-based child sexual exploitation in 2023.
Okay, 700 recorded group-based offenses in 2023 from that specific COCAD data set. But the audit is very clear about the limitations of these numbers, isn't it? They don't think that's the real figure.
Absolutely not. The audit explicitly states it is highly unlikely that these data reflect the true scale of child sexual exploitation or group-based exploitation.
Why so unlikely?
Well, it's due to the acknowledged issues with data consistency, the limitations of the COCAD dataset itself. It only provides a snapshot picture of data recorded in a specific period, and the huge issue of underreporting.
Wait, so these numbers are just the tip of the iceberg. What's visible through the current inadequate data systems?
Yeah.
And a major reason for the invisibility of the problem is underreporting. Why don't victims report or disclose what's happening? What does the audit say?
The audit cites estimates of reporting rates for serious sexual offenses before age 16, suggesting only around 7% of victims and survivors inform the police at the time of the offense. 7%.
Only 7% at the time. That's incredibly low.
It is, and this figure only rises to 18% ever reporting.
18% ever.
Wow. Based on ONS data, the most common reasons given for not telling anyone about their experience at the time were embarrassment, fear of not being believed, and fear of humiliation.
All understandable, tragically.
Yeah. And the audit notes that child sexual abuse that is spotted around the time it is occurring is more often identified by an adult recognizing signs rather than the child disclosing directly.
That makes heartbreaking sense. The trauma, the shame, the fear of disbelief, these are immense barriers. And the audit notes certain groups might be even less likely to report or be identified.
Yes, it mentions some groups are less likely than others to report. Boys are less likely than girls to disclose abuse during childhood.
Why is that thought to be?
Well, the audit suggests this underreporting might be linked more to sexual abuse of boys being underidentified by professionals rather than necessarily lower overall prevalence, just not picked up as often.
I see. Professionals missing the signs in boys.
Potentially. It also highlights people from ethnic minority groups as being less likely to report.
What specifically does the audit say about those groups and the challenges? Why might that be?
It references findings from ICSA and the Center of Expertise on Child Sexual Abuse. ICSA found that cultural stereotypes, racism, shame, stigma, and gender expectations hinder the identification, disclosure, and response to child sexual abuse in some ethnic minority communities.
So societal and cultural barriers.
Exactly. And furthermore, a lack of cultural competence and diversity among professionals is seen as exacerbating this issue. The Center of Expertise commented that children of African, Asian, and Caribbean heritage are underrepresented in police-recorded child sexual abuse offense data.
Underrepresented in the data, okay.
Noting the difficulties professionals face in identifying and acting on concerns about children from minority ethnic backgrounds. The audit also mentions a pilot study by the Muslim Women's Network highlighting specific vulnerabilities for Asian and/or Muslim children and women associated with cultural expectations.
That's a critical point the audit raises, that cultural factors and system limitations, including a lack of professional cultural competence, are likely driving reporting disparities and underrepresentation in the data, rather than reflecting actual prevalence across ethnic groups. It's about who gets seen and heard.
Precisely. It's a really important nuance the audit brings out.
Let's move on now to the characteristics described in the audit, looking at both perpetrators and victims. After highlighting the immense data challenges, the audit pivots to describe the people at the heart of this problem, the perpetrators and their victims. How does the report detail the methods used by perpetrators? We touched on grooming earlier.
Right. The audit describes a systematic grooming process. This often starts by perpetrators showering children with gifts and attention, using that boyfriend model we mentioned, treating them kindly, sharing secrets to build a connection.
So that emotional and social isolation is a deliberate tactic to build control.
Exactly. They also use drugs and alcohol extensively to increase compliance and create dependency, sometimes offered in exchange for sex with one or more men.
And then the shift to coercion.
Yes. As grooming progresses and dependency is built, coercion and violence may follow to increase control and suppress resistance. That Operation Retriever quote again. There had been grooming behavior designed to extinguish freedom of choice, to create an illusion of consent. It really encapsulates it.
That quote really captures how exploitation works. It steals agency. The report also mentions the logistics of how victims are controlled, like moving them around.
Yes, moving children from place to be exploited is a common tactic, often using hotels with anonymous check-in facilities to avoid detection.
Making them harder to find, harder to help.
Exactly. And increasingly, grooming is also starting and taking place online before potentially moving to in-person abuse. The methods adapt.
And what about the perpetrators themselves? The audit describes the dynamics within the groups. What did it find there?
The groups are often described as loosely interconnected, based around existing social connections such as family, work, or community links.
So, not necessarily strangers, but people known to each other.
Often, yes. This tends to make them broadly homogeneous in age, ethnic background, and socioeconomic status within a specific group.
Okay.
And a key point from the audit on the group dynamics is the disinhibiting effect. Acting in a group has a disinhibiting effect on the perpetrators, whether through shared misogyny, a sense of entitlement, or othering the victims.
Othering.
Yeah, basically viewing the victims as less than human, as objects. This allows them to disregard their victims' humanity and suffering.
That othering aspect, reducing victims to objects or less than human, is chilling and helps explain how these group acts can occur. The report also links sexual exploitation to criminal exploitation, right? It's not always just one thing.
It does. It finds that children who are criminally exploited, for example, involved in selling drugs or county lines, often experience sexual exploitation as well. It's intertwined.
How so?
Sexual abuse is used as a means of control, coercion, or initiation into criminal activities, further entrenching the child's victimization and making it harder to escape.
So it's another layer of control.
Exactly. Bernardo's data from 2021, cited in the audit, showed that sexual exploitation was the second most prevalent form of exploitation at 55%, after selling drugs, 75% in cases seen by their services.
That's a high percentage.
It is. And the audit notes it is often easier for police to spot the signs of criminal exploitation, like having large amounts of cash or specific clothing, than the subtle signs of sexual exploitation in the same child.
So these forms of exploitation are often deeply intertwined, and professionals might only see one layer initially. The audit provides some specific examples of cases it reviewed to illustrate these tactics, doesn't it?
Yes, it mentions a Case 4, described as involving suspected organized crime group involvement, where a child was advertised on an adult sex work website and visited by more than 25 men over 4 days after being moved to a hotel. Just horrific.
25 then.
Another example, Case 5, is the sexual exploitation of a girl who was raped by her boyfriend, who was also a child, and threatened with further rape if she failed to share sexual images of herself. It also notes girls being targeted by multiple men online trying to get them to meet up for sex.
These specific examples drawn directly from the report really bring home the horrific reality and the methods used. Now, let's talk about the victims. What characteristics and vulnerabilities does the audit highlight as making children susceptible to this type of exploitation?
Well, victims are described as vulnerable, often adolescent girls who have had a history of living in care and/or having repeated episodes of going missing. Though the audit is careful to note exceptions, victims can come from relatively stable backgrounds, too.
Okay, but there are clear risk factors identified.
Yes. Other known risk factors include children who have experienced previous abuse, repeated episodes of going missing, or who may have learning or physical disabilities. The audit also notes that many children subject to sexual exploitation come from backgrounds which lead them to be more vulnerable to demonstrations of affection or attention from others due to a lack of this in their lives. They're seeking connection.
And the report specifically addresses the vulnerability of children in care settings. What does it say there?
This is a critical point the audit emphasizes, calling it a powerful vulnerability. It states that being in care is a risk factor for exploitation, not inherently a protective factor.
Not protective. How can that be?
Partly because perpetrators actively target children's homes and residential care settings, seeking out those who most desperately seek love and attachment. As was observed in Rotherham, they exploit the gaps in the safety net provided by the state for children who cannot remain safely at home.
That's incredibly powerful and disturbing. The very system meant to protect can sometimes expose vulnerabilities. The report also notes that victims might not see themselves as victims at the time. How does that work?
That's right. Victims often don't view the relationship as abusive at the time they are being groomed and exploited, especially if the grooming has been effective using the boyfriend model.
They think it's real.
They may feel they are in a relationship or have some level of agency even when they are being manipulated. It's part of the deception. The audit notes they may even, as a result of the coercion and control, become involved in criminal activities or, tragically, even recruit other children into the group, often while still being victims themselves.
That paints a really complex picture of the victim's experience and involvement. It's not black and white. Now, the audit does touch on the demographics of perpetrators, including ethnicity, which has been a significant and often, let's face it, contentious point of discussion in public discourse. What does the report say about that?
Okay, yeah. The audit addresses this directly, stating that national data on perpetrator ethnicity is poor and inadequate over many years, calling this a failure of successive politicians and policymakers.
A failure of policy.
Yes. It notes that limited improvements have been made and that while some police forces hold better local data, nationally, it's problematic and there's no single reliable national data set for group-based CSC.
So getting a clear, reliable national picture on perpetrator ethnicity is difficult due to historical data failures. But the audit does cite some specific reports and data sets that include ethnicity data, right? Even with the caveats.
Yes, it presents findings from specific sources it reviewed, while cautioning about their limitations. One is a summary of CEO 2011 data, presented in a Home Office 2020 paper summarizing various studies,
Okay, what did that show?
where ethnicity data was available for alleged offenders, and importantly, ethnicity was unknown for 38% of cases, a huge chunk.
Nearly 40% unknown.
Right. But where it was known, 30% were identified as white and 28% as Asian. But again, the audit explicitly cautions that these figures should be treated with significant caution due to the high amount of missing data.
Okay, so that's one older snapshot, but with a large caveat about missing data. What else does the audit present? Any more recent data?
It references the ICSA 2022 report, specifically the investigation report into child sexual exploitation by organized networks. That report indicated an overrepresentation of Asian and Black offenders in group-based child sexual exploitation in the studies ICSA reviewed.
Okay, an overrepresentation found in group-based cases, specifically in those studies.
Yes. But importantly, the same ICSA report also stated, drawing on the same studies, that most of the same studies show that the majority of offenders are white in child sexual abuse and exploitation overall.
So the distinction is being made between findings on group-based CSE specifically compared to CSAE overall in those studies. That's a key nuance, and there's a newer data set mentioned, the COCAD one.
Yes. The Hydrant Program's COCAD 2023 data, which specifically looks at group-based CSAE offenses across England and Wales. This data set from 2023 identified 55% of suspects as white, 28% as Asian, and 17% as other.
55% white, 28% Asian, 17% other in that 2023 group-based data set. And does the audit make any comparison to population data based on this?
It does mention the comparison made in the source regarding the proportion of Asian offenders in some area case samples like South Yorkshire Rotherham being higher than the overall Asian population percentage in those specific areas based on ONS census data.
Right.
It also notes that the proportion of Asian offenders in the national COCAD data, 28%, is significantly higher than the percentage of the population who identify as Asian nationally, which was 9.3% in the 2021 census.
So the audit presents these specific data points from various sources it reviewed, noting the overall poor national picture and the need for better data, while highlighting what the currently available, though limited, data suggests about group-based CSE specifically.
Correct. And it also references Annex E in the report, which lists child safeguarding reviews where perpetrator ethnicity was identified. That list shows a range of backgrounds involved in different areas over time: Asian, white, Eastern European, and others, depending on the specific area reviewed. It's not uniform across the country.
So it's complex and varies locally.
Exactly. The audit is reporting the data it found in its review and advocating for improved national data collection. It also makes a crucial point directly addressing the sensitivity of this data,
Yes.
stating that avoiding ethnicity issues plays into the hands of those who want to sow division. It references the weaponization of people's trauma by those seeking to spread division and hate. It even quotes Gabrielle Shaw of NAPAC saying, "Someone's trauma should not be used to score political points or as clickbait."
That's an important point from the audit itself, emphasizing the need for impartiality and warning against the misuse of this sensitive information. It's about the facts, not fueling division. Finally, on perpetrator characteristics, the audit mentions recent age trends. Anything significant there?
Yes. Recent national police data, particularly from the Policing Knowledge Hub VKPP's analysis, is indicating a lower average age amongst child sexual abuse and exploitation perpetrators overall compared to previously seen data and research.
A lower average age. Why might that be?
The audit suggests this trend is likely a result of the increase in online offending, child-on-child offending, where the perpetrator is also a child, and increased reporting of offenses through schools.
Okay.
For example, in cases where children have shared indecent images of themselves reported to the police, one child might be recorded as a suspect, influencing the average age downwards.
So changes in the nature of the crime, like more online stuff, and changes in reporting practices are influencing how the data on perpetrator age looks nationally. Makes sense. Now, the audit doesn't just describe the problem. It takes a hard look at the systems meant to tackle it and identifies significant systemic challenges and failures that have persisted. This sounds like a major part of the report.
It is. A central finding running through the entire report is what the audit describes as a repeating cycle.
A repeating cycle. What does that mean?
It refers to seminal moments of scandal and public outrage, which lead to bursts of government focus and activity, but no sustained improvement.
So lots of noise, Then things die down again.
Pretty much. And the tragic consequence, the audit says, is leaving victims and the public with insufficient justice, action, accountability, or answers.
So a cycle of reports and reviews following scandals, but not leading to lasting effective change on the ground. Why does the audit suggest this is happening? What's the root cause?
The audit points to a complex and fragmented landscape with responsibilities split across multiple government departments, Home Office, DFE, DHSC, and statutory bodies like police, local authorities, health, and so on. It's complicated.
Too many cooks.
Perhaps. It finds that strong leadership, common purpose, and above all, a grip on the policy has been lacking over at least the last decade, leading to inconsistent implementation of strategies. No one seems to be fully in charge and driving it through consistently.
So a lack of clear, consistent direction and coordination from the top seems to be a major issue. And this fragmentation seems intrinsically linked to major problems with data and information sharing, right? You mentioned data problems earlier.
Absolutely. It's a recurring theme and a significant failure of public policy over many years, that there remains limited, reliable national data and poor information sharing. It's a constant refrain.
How bad is the information sharing issue?
The audit details the system failures in information sharing across departments and agencies. Police data and intelligence, for example, is stored across multiple non-communicating systems, some forces reportedly having around 100 different systems. 100.
100 systems?
Yeah.
How can anyone connect the dots?
Exactly. It requires time-consuming manual searching and significantly impedes intelligence building. Officers, the audit notes, can't see the wood for the trees in terms of national or even regional intelligence pictures.
That sounds incredibly inefficient, dangerous, and like a huge barrier to proactively identifying threats.
It is. And national systems designed to help, like the Police National Database, PND, established after the SOAM inquiry precisely to improve information sharing about children, also have significant limitations, according to the audit.
What's wrong with the PND?
Access is rationed, with long waiting lists of up to 18 months for officers needing a license to use it effectively. 18 months.
18 months just to get access to the national database.
Yes. This makes it incredibly difficult for officers to access crucial intelligence from other forces, even when victims or perpetrators move across boundaries.
Which they obviously do.
Of course. The audit is deeply concerned that important information about children at risk might remain unidentified because of these systemic problems, so missing opportunities for timely intervention and disruption of abusers. It notes that local safeguarding partnerships often rely heavily on the police for threat assessment, and data sharing is often limited to case-specific meetings rather than proactive strategic intelligence sharing.
That's a huge red flag. Crucial intelligence needed to protect children being effectively locked away by bureaucracy and old systems. What about data and identification within children's services? Does the audit look at that side?
It does, and it presents concerning data showing a fall in children in need assessments, identifying CISA concerns, and a fall in child protection plans, specifically on the grounds of sexual abuse in England since 2017-18.
A fall? How is that possible, given what we know about the scale of the problem, even with the reporting issues?
This is a key question the audit poses. It questions whether this reflects a real fall in incidence or, more likely, a failure to identify and record sexual abuse correctly, perhaps focusing on other issues like neglect instead.
So neglect might be overshadowing sexual abuse concerns.
That's the worry raised. It quotes the Dorset Review, which found professionals were unclear about the signs, lacked confidence to ask children about sexual abuse, and were reluctant to pursue concerns of child sexual abuse when an alternative hypothesis, often neglect, is present.
So professionals potentially miscategorizing or missing the signs of sexual abuse, which means children aren't getting the specific protection they need. That's really concerning.
It is. And the audit also points to a mismatch in data between police and children's services in some areas, reinforcing this concern.
How so?
It notes a mismatch between police-recorded contact child sexual abuse rates and local authority child in need assessment rates for CSAS per 1,000 children in some areas, like Durham and Hampshire, suggesting potential under-identification by children's services in those areas.
The numbers just don't line up between agencies.
Right. The audit found in visits that one police force using missing persons data identified children they considered at high risk who are often not on children's services radar at all, highlighting how the system is not sufficiently joined up. This mismatch, the audit says, merits further investigation. It also notes a decline in serious incident notifications, SINs, and Serious Case Review SIL CSPR specifically related to CSE, despite the audit having sight of recent cases that, in its view, met the rapid review threshold but didn't result in one.
That lack of joined-up thinking, data sharing, and potentially consistent identification seems like a persistent and dangerous barrier. The report also looks at health services as key partners who might see the signs, right? What's the picture there?
Health services are identified as absolutely key delivery partners. They will see many of the consequences of children being sexually abused and exploited, even where it's not yet known to the police or local authorities.
Where might they see them?
Children may present in GP surgeries, community and mental health services, at maternity care, sexual health clinics, and sexual assault referral centers, SARCs. They're on the front line in many ways.
But is the data situation any better there?
Unfortunately, mirroring the other sectors, the audit finds a significant lack of national data available from health services on child sexual abuse and exploitation, another big gap.
Another major data gap preventing a full national picture. But they do present some data from SARCs as an example. What do SARCs show?
Yes, the SARCs provide an example of what is being collected and offers an important, albeit limited, window into the scale and nature of need. In 2023-24, SARCs in England had over 9,500 initial contacts with under 18s.
9,500 contacts in a year.
Yes. The data shows the victim age breakdown, with 68% of those seen being between 11 and 18. Notably, referrals from children's services to SARCs have almost quadrupled in the past 2 years, from just over 1,000 to over 4,000.
Quadrupled? Why the jump?
It suggests increased use of SARCs as a resource by children's services, which could be positive, but it also highlights the volume of need. This SARC data demonstrates that data could potentially be collected and analyzed across other healthcare settings if there was a national mandate and system.
So, SARCs are providing a crucial window, but a broader national picture from health services on how many children are accessing services with potential signs of abuse is missing. The report also raises concerns about missed opportunities in health settings, referencing the Telford inquiry. What happened there?
Yes, the Telford inquiry heard powerful evidence from witnesses that health services, GPs, sexual health clinics sometimes provided services like abortions and contraception to underage children, and no questions were asked. Just process them.
No questions asked.
That's what the testimony suggested. The audit quotes a witness who repeatedly visited a GP for the morning after pill at age 14 and felt no one really cared.
That's devastating.
It is. The audit notes that while there are legitimate concerns that requiring mandatory referrals for under 16s accessing sexual health services might deter help seeking.
A genuine dilemma.
True, but the testimony highlights how health services had potentially let down children by not asking questions or raising concerns about familiar faces, repeatedly seeking services, illustrating missed opportunities for intervention.
That's a very concrete and devastating example of potential missed intervention points at the front line. Finally, the audit looks at the criminal justice system process, from police to prosecution. What are the issues identified there?
The process involves police gathering evidence and submitting files to the Crown Prosecution Service, CPS, who then decide whether to charge based on evidence and the realistic prospect of conviction. That's the theory.
And the practice.
The audit presents data on prosecutions showing that while overall child sexual abuse and exploitation prosecutions have increased, over 40% of these are for indecent images of children offenses.
Why is that significant?
Because those cases are often less complex than group-based exploitation cases, which require more investigation and coordination. The audit also highlights significant delays in the process once a case reaches the CPS.
Delays. How long were we talking about for a charging decision? This must be awful for victims.
In 2023-24, the average time from police submission to a charging decision in a child sexual abuse case was 123 days.
Over 4 months.
Yes. That's 9 days longer than the previous year and significantly slower than pre-pandemic levels. And there was wide variation across different CPS divisions, ranging from 53 days up to 202 days.
200 days.
Yeah.
Nearly 7 months in some places.
Yes. And central complex cases handled by the Organized Child Sexual Abuse Unit, OCSAU, sometimes took even longer.
What's the impact of these lengthy delays on victims? It must be immense.
The audit states the impact cannot be overstated. Extended wait times significantly increase the likelihood of victims withdrawing from proceedings.
I just give up.
Understandably, perhaps, especially as many are adults by the time cases reach court after years of delay. They may have moved on or find the prospect of giving evidence too daunting. Some may be living near defendants on bail and face threats or intimidation, deterring them and others from coming forward.
Living near their abusers while waiting. Unimaginable.
And the audit also describes the particular difficulty and trauma of multi-perpetrator trials for victims who must relive their experiences in court and face cross-examination defendant by defendant, often with limited specialist support.
That sounds incredibly re-traumatizing. The lack of specialist support for victims navigating this entire process is also noted as a gap, isn't it?
Yes, the audit notes there remains a shortage of specialist sexual violence help and that voluntary sector support is patchy across the country. While some initiatives exist, like the trauma and resilience services attached to Operation Stovewood for non-recent victims, the lack of specialist advocates for sexual violence who can guide victims through both the criminal justice and other complaint processes came up repeatedly during the audit's visits to different areas, a real gap in support.
Let's dig into some specific barriers and recommendations highlighted in the audit that aim to break this cycle of failure. A key concept discussed, particularly in relation to how systems respond, is adultification. What does the audit mean by that?
Yes, the audit discusses adultification. It's the phenomenon of mistaking adolescent children, particularly those in care, from minority ethnic backgrounds or with other vulnerabilities, for adults.
Why does that happen?
It can be due to their physical appearance, their experiences, or socioeconomic background. It leads to them being viewed as more responsible, more complicit, or overly resilient than they actually are. They're still children.
And the damaging consequence of that misperception.
It means safeguarding protections are not fully applied because the child is not seen as a child in need of protection. This leaves them at a higher risk of harm.
So they fall through the cracks.
Exactly. Instead of a safeguarding response tailored to child vulnerability, they may receive a criminal justice response, being viewed as responsible or even criminal rather than as victims.
Criminalizing the victim.
Yes. The audit notes that children can be criminalized for offenses they committed while being groomed and controlled, and these criminal records can blight their chances in adult life, preventing them from getting bank accounts, driving, or going on school trips, despite guidance from the CPS and police against indefensibly criminalizing exploited children.
That's a profound injustice. The system punishing the victim for crimes they were coerced into as part of their exploitation. And the audit connects adultification back to the age of consent issue, arguing it impacts how cases are treated in court.
It does. The audit notes that while the law is clear that under 16s cannot consent to sexual activity, prosecution for rape of 13, 15-year-olds may be less likely to succeed because children of this age are sometimes viewed as adults who are capable of giving consent in practice, especially within the legal system's interpretation.
Even though legally they can't consent.
Right. The audit calls for clearer solutions to tackle these areas of bias and grayness that weaken the protection and justice afforded to child victims abused and exploited by adults.
Moving on, the audit talks powerfully about denial and a lack of accountability as persistent barriers. What's the issue here?
There is palpable frustration from survivors, noted in the audit, about the ongoing injustice and the lack of accountability of the services and professionals that had dismissed them, failed to act on reports or provide the protection they sought. In some cases, this meant their abuse continued for longer than it should have done.
Survivors feel let down and ignored.
Deeply. And we also heard from frustrated frontline workers during the audit process. The audit makes a strong statement that inquiries and reviews often focus on systems and procedures, not on individuals who have done wrong through inaction or mistakes.
No individual accountability.
Often not enough, it seems, and recommendations for change are not driven through with sufficient rigor or determination. The pattern of denial and insufficient accountability, it says, continues and deeply lets down victims and the public.
The report cites specific historical examples of this denial and resistance to review, doesn't it? To show it's not a new problem.
Yes. It mentions Rotherham, where the council demonstrated resolute denial of the scale of the problem even after the J report, with change only being forced after a best value inspection found this entrenched denial.
So denial even after a major report.
Yes. It also highlights Rochdale, specifically the independent assurance review into operation span. The report notes a reluctance by the statutory authorities, in this case GMP and Rochdale Council, to openly review the events and to work cooperatively.
What happened there?
Legal wrangling over data access delayed the review for years, with Rochdale Council initially reluctant to give access to their records and GMP taking legal advice. It wasn't until a new chief constable took up his position that the legal advice confirming disclosure was safe and appropriate was made available, and information was finally shared years later. Years of delay.
Those examples really underscore the depth of institutional resistance and the delays that have hampered progress and accountability, leaving victims waiting for answers. Another specific area highlighted as a point of vulnerability and control is taxi licensing. Why is that relevant to this issue?
The audit identifies taxis and private hire vehicles as a common thread in child sexual exploitation cases, noting their involvement from an early stage in the Rotherham cases, and repeated concerns and reports into Telford, Oldham, and Newcastle.
How were they used?
They are used to transport children to and from locations of exploitation, often within the nighttime economy. Local authorities are responsible for issuing licenses, and while statutory guidance exists from the Department for Transport, the audit notes some authorities go far beyond this guidance with more rigorous standards.
Like Rotherham post-scandal. Did they tighten up?
Exactly. Rotherham is presented as a positive example of transforming their approach post-scandal, introducing rigorous retrospective standards for drivers and vehicles that went far beyond statutory and good practice guides at the time and influenced later national standards. So it can be done.
But is that happening everywhere?
No. The audit also highlights the current serious issue of out-of-area taxis, described as a broken system that creates safeguarding risks.
Out-of-area taxes? What's that?
It cites figures obtained by the GMB union and reported by the BBC, showing one single local authority licensed over 8,500 new taxis in 5 months, with up to 96% of licenses issued in 2023-24 being for drivers living elsewhere in the country.
So one council licensing thousands of drivers who don't even live there.
Exactly. And calls for action from regional figures like the mayor of Greater Manchester are mentioned, highlighting that drivers licensed with potentially lower standards in one area can operate freely in others. The audit believes consistency and more rigorous standards across all local authorities, along with a fix for the out-of-area issue, are necessary for safeguarding.
So, a potential safeguarding loophole there that requires urgent national attention and consistent standards. Now, let's focus on what seems to be a key area for action and a critical recommendation in the report. The age of consent gray area. This sounded really important.
This is a crucial focus point, particularly in Chapter 8 and the report's recommendations. Okay, so the law states the age of consent in the UK is 16. The Sexual Offences Act 2003 states that any sexual activity involving children under 16 is unlawful.
Okay, 16 is the line.
For children under 13, there's strict liability. Any sexual activity is automatically illegal, whatever the perpetrator knew, believed, or intended about the child's age. It's black and white for under 13s.
Okay, that's clear. Under 13 is automatic. But there's a difference, a nuance for 13, 15-year-olds. That's where the gray area comes in.
Yes. The law for 13, 15-year-olds is described in the audit as less clear-cut. Although any sexual activity with a 13, 15-year-old is unlawful, the decision on whether to charge, and importantly, which offense to charge with, like rape, versus the lesser charge of sexual activity with a child, is left more open to interpretation for this age group.
Why was that distinction originally made?
The original intention of this nuance was largely aimed at avoiding criminalizing someone who reasonably believed a child was older than they were, or avoiding criminalizing potentially consensual relationships between teenagers themselves, though the audit notes this latter scenario is less relevant to adult-on-child abuse.
And the audit finds that this nuance is being used, or perhaps misused, to protect much older men who have groomed children.
Precisely. The audit states explicitly that, in practice, this nuance in law is being used to the benefit of much older men who had groomed underage children for sex.
How does that work in practice?
When deciding whether to charge with rape or the lesser offense of sexual activity with a child for 13, 15-year-olds, the CPS prosecutor will consider whether the child consented based on the definition in Section 74 of the Sexual Offences Act 2003, which means agreeing by choice, with freedom and capacity.
Choice, freedom, and capacity.
Yes. And they consider factors like the child's age and maturity versus the suspects, the history of the relationship, the child's vulnerability, evidence of grooming through gifts, attention, false promises, and the provision of alcohol or drugs and their effect on the child's capacity to choose.
So even though the law says under 16 cannot legally consent, the legal process for 13, 15-year-olds allows the concept of consent to be debated and potentially used in the perpetrator's favor, especially if grooming has made the child believe they are in love or acting voluntarily.
Exactly. That's the core of the issue highlighted. And the audit finds that prosecution for rape of 13, 15-year-olds is less likely to succeed than for under 13s or for charges of sexual activity with a child.
Less likely to succeed. Why?
Partly because children this age are more likely to be viewed as adults who are capable of giving consent within the legal system's assessment, despite their actual age and the context of grooming. It links back to that adultification issue.
Right.
The audit provides a powerful case study where charges for rape of a 13-year-old were dropped despite substantial evidence because the defense was able to show suggestive messages from the child, and the child insisted in statements she was in love with the older man and would not support a prosecution.
So the grooming worked, essentially, to undermine the prosecution.
That's how the case study is presented, illustrating the difficulties with prosecuting men for raping children under 16 and how these gray areas are used by perpetrators and their legal teams.
That case study is incredibly illustrative of the problem, showing how effective grooming can impact a victim's own perception and subsequent cooperation, which then impacts the legal outcome, allowing perpetrators to evade justice for rape. The audit also includes conviction data comparison from the Ministry of Justice to support this finding about lower success rates for rape prosecutions in this age group.
It cites Ministry of Justice data showing that in 2024, prosecutions for rape of a child under 16 were less likely to result in a conviction, showing a 35% conviction rate, compared to rape of a child under 13, 67%, or sexual activity with a child under 16, 80%.
35% versus 67 or 80%. That's a huge difference.
It is. And the source clarifies this isn't a true conviction rate for all cases starting that year, but a comparison of prosecutions and convictions recorded in that specific year. But even with that clarification, the comparison in outcomes is stark and supports the audit's finding that achieving a conviction for rape is significantly harder for the 13-15 age group than for younger children or less serious sexual offenses.
It points to a real problem in how those cases are handled.
Yes. And despite the statutory definition changes back in 2015, removing the idea of victims voluntarily engaging, the audit finds that debates about 13, 15-year-olds consenting to sex are taking place within the legal system, contrary to the spirit of the law.
That's a fundamental issue that undermines the protection of teenage victims. And based on this, the audit presents a clear key recommendation for legislative change. What do they propose?
It does. This is one of the most prominent recommendations in Chapter 8. The audit proposes that the law should be changed so adult men who groom and have sex with 13, 15-year-olds receive mandatory charges of rape, mirroring the approach taken in countries such as France.
Mandatory charges of rape for adults grooming and having sex with 13, 15-year-olds. That's a strong proposal.
It is. The justification provided is that this would tighten the law and make it absolutely clear that children cannot consent when they have been groomed and exploited by adults, removing this gray area that benefits perpetrators.
That's a direct, strong call for legislative action to close what the audit sees as a loophole being exploited by groomers. Finally, let's quickly summarize the other high-level recommendations from the audit. What else does it propose to fix these systemic issues? There were 12 in total, right?
Yes, 12 recommendations. The audit states frankly that progress has not matched public concern or energy, and past recommendations haven't been implemented with sufficient rigor or determination, a familiar story, unfortunately.
So what else needs to happen, according to the audit?
Key recommendations include tightening the law regarding consent for 13, 15-year-olds, as we just discussed. It also recommends launching a national police operation and a national inquiry, coordinating targeted investigations into past failures and cases.
A national inquiry?
Yes, which should include a review of cases not prosecuted and a proactive review of police and children's services records to identify children currently at risk or harmed over the last 10 years. It suggests potentially using innovative approaches like the Smith algorithm developed by West Yorkshire Police to identify patterns in missing children data.
So not just looking forward, but actively reviewing past failings and proactively searching for current victims using data. That sounds significant.
Yes. It also recommends reviewing the criminal convictions of victims who committed offenses while being groomed and controlled, and quashing convictions where appropriate.
Addressing the criminalization of victims.
Exactly. Ensuring accountability for agencies that failed victims, improving victim identification and support, and strengthening national oversight and data collection sharing across all relevant agencies. It calls for increasing joint working and training across agencies, addressing those taxi licensing issues, particularly the out-of-area problem.
And a big one on how investigations are treated.
Yes, treating CSE investigations with the same urgency, tactics, and capabilities as serious and organized crime, potentially through the NCA or another national body, using tools like HOMES or TOEX.
Treating CSE as serious and organized crime feels like a significant proposed shift in approach, bringing higher-level national resources and tactics to bear.
It does. The audit also recommends commissioning research into the drivers of group-based child sexual exploitation, including online offending, cultural factors, and the role of the group, to address a long-standing gap in understanding and ensure the response evolves based on evidence.
We need to understand why it happens better.
Exactly. And finally, it calls for fully resourcing specialist victim support across the country, making sure the help is actually there when needed.
It sounds like a comprehensive package of recommendations covering legal change, policing, social services, health, criminal justice, and support, but with a strong message about past failures in implementation being the main barrier.
Indeed. The audit's concluding thought on the recommendations is that their swift implementation requires decisive leadership and a collective determination to fix past failings and build a strong approach for the future. It states clearly that we need to draw a line in the sand, acknowledge past failures, apologize unreservedly to victims, and act now on these recommendations.
So, to wrap this deep dive, what this audit lays bare is a complex and persistent problem of group-based child sexual exploitation, one that has been hampered by repeated systemic failures across police, children's services, health, and the justice system, despite numerous reviews and reports over decades.
That's right. It details specific failures in data collection and sharing, in system coordination, in ensuring accountability for past failures and overcoming resistance to review, and critically, in the practical application of laws like the age of consent, particularly for 13, 15-year-olds, creating that gray area that benefits perpetrators.
And these persistent issues contribute to that repeating cycle we discussed.
Exactly. A cycle that has left vulnerable children unprotected and victims without sufficient justice or answers.
The audit is critical, presenting detailed findings on these issues based on its review, but it also acknowledges that some positive steps and innovative approaches exist in pockets, right? It's not all negative.
No, it does highlight potential routes forward contained within its recommendations, such as treating CSE as SOC or the potential of better data use from sources like SARCs. It notes examples of innovative and caring approaches, effective joint working where it exists, the potential of SARC data collection, and the vital work of the voluntary sector standing up for victims when statutory services have failed.
The overall message remains.
But the core message is that overall progress has not been sufficient to break the cycle. The audit's call for action is clear. A line in the sand is needed, requiring acknowledging past failures, apologizing, and swift, determined action on the recommendations to finally break the cycle and deliver justice.
And that brings us back to the victims, whose experiences underpin this entire report. The audit's detailed findings on systemic failures, institutional denial, and the persistent gap between reports and effective action are stark reminders of the immense cost when systems fail to protect.
Absolutely. Society owes a debt to survivors for enduring those failures and for their courage in sharing their stories to try and force change.
Delivering justice, acknowledging those past failures, and apologizing are presented by the audit as essential steps.
Essential steps to breaking the cycle and ensuring we do not end up back here again in a few years' time, facing the same issues raised in report after report for decades. That has to stop.
So, as you consider the scale of the problem, the persistent systemic failures highlighted in detail by this audit, and the comprehensive recommendations laid out, what responsibility does this report suggest falls to all those policymakers, professionals across different sectors, and the public in ensuring the cycle of failure is finally broken and the protection of vulnerable children becomes a true, consistent priority?